Hey everyone, Eric Rennie here, and welcome to the 54th episode of the Writ Podcast. There are two leadership races going on right now in the country at the federal level, and it's for two parties going in very different directions. On the one hand, we have the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre. He's raising a ton of money, seems to be on track to take the party in a pretty new direction. And then for the Greens, you have Elizabeth May, who seems to be taking the party back in time. So to talk about these two races, I'm joined by the CBC's Aaron Wherry. Hey, Aaron.
Hey,
So we'll start with the Conservatives, and there was a debate earlier this week, if we can call it that. Now, I have to admit, I didn't watch anything beyond a few little clips and read a couple coverage of it. I think you had to watch the whole thing, and I wonder if you had any, what was your broad theme thoughts about what happened at this quote unquote debate?
yeah, I mean, it wasn't much of a debate, right? Just from a staging perspective and everything else, it wasn't the greatest. It wasn't the greatest debate I've ever watched. But the biggest problem was the fact that Pierre Poilievre wasn't there. And if you don't have the front runner in the debate, it's not much of a debate. I think so. A couple of things I think are kind of actual takeaways. One is, the fact that Poilievre not only skipped this debate, but that he rained criticism down on the party while doing so, and then went out to Regina and held an event and mocked the candidates who did participate. I think it kind of sends the message that, like, if you think, Pierre Poilievre's anti-establishment politics, if you're a conservative who thinks that's always going to be directed just at liberals and New Democrats and the media academics and the governor of the Bank of Canada, don't lull yourself into that false sense of security. Like, his anti-establishment politics extend apparently to the Conservative Party. We'll see whether that changes to some degree if he becomes leader. But I think it underlines the fact that to Poilievre, you're either with him or against him, and you shouldn't assume that just because you're a conservative that you're necessarily not going to fall into the latter group. The other thing I think, that kind of came out of this debate is, some last sort of parting words or final words from Jean Charest and maybe to a certain extent Scott Aitchison. Both of them kind of saying, but particularly Charest saying, anger is not a plan. It's not a political program, and you need to channel, if people are angry, you need to channel them into, sort of positive solutions. And I think that could have been an argument that Charest could have used and maybe succeeded with to a certain extent in this race. I think it's coming too late for him. But I think if the Poilievre campaign, if Poilievre's time as leader ends in tears, I guess Charest gets to say he told you so, that this wasn't going to go well. But it kind of feels like a last kind of gasping warning from Charest, before Poilievre becomes leader.
It does. I'm not sure who would have been watching that debate in terms of who was still on the fence. Because if you're on the fence between Charest, Aitchison, and Baber, I'm not sure who you are exactly. It's a
Yeah,
very strange kind of dynamic. And in all likelihood, though, you had only one of the top three candidates actually participating in this. So it was a very strange thing that it kind of went ahead. But I guess conservatives had to go ahead with it. They couldn't let one of the candidates, and then Leslie Lewis, who also didn't attend, decide whether this goes ahead. But clearly, $50,000, not enough of a disincentive to get people to not participate. Both of those campaigns were fined $50,000, but they've got that money to burn. So I don't know what parties do about this in the future, especially how do you make people show up to this thing if it's not in their interest anymore?
yeah, I don't know that you can, and to that degree, it's kind of remarkable, right? Like, it's not like this debate was organized by a bunch of New Democrats or downtown liberal elites. This was a debate organized by the Conservative Party and a leadership organizing committee that was led by Ian Brodie, Stephen Harper's former chief of staff and a foundational figure, in the rise of the kind of modern Conservative Party. Uh, and uh, and the party had taken sort of an informal vote of party members whether they wanted a third debate, and I believe it was like 60% of them said yes, they wanted a third debate. So it's, and then, to be fined $50,000, like that, presumably, unless I'm wrong, that's money that you're taking out of the money that had been donated to you by party members, and you're using it to pay off a fine for not showing up to a debate that party members seemingly wanted to see. And I just don't, I mean, it is kind of a remarkable thing. We've seen leaders kind of manipulate debate schedules and candidates not go to local debates during elections, and it's not completely unheard of. And you can make the strategic argument, obviously, that Poilievre's the front runner. He's obviously going to try to minimize the amount of risk, and he doesn't want to, unnecessarily put himself in harm's way. But it is kind of remarkable that, like, a politician, or two politicians in this case, can look at all that and say, yeah, screw it, we're not going. And that's where I come back to, Poilievre, and to a certain extent, Leslie Lewis, is, anti-establishment politics. Like, this is, like, it's not, don't assume, if you're a conservative, that he's just going to be throwing rhetorical bombs at people you don't like. His anti-establishment politics, like, this is kind of a logical continuation of that.
I would say for Leslie Lewis, I think that if it was Poilievre who more or less gave her permission to pull out of it, right? If Poilievre would have participated, she would have been there. But it's almost as if he is bigger than the party at this stage. And if he doesn't want to go, then it's not a real debate. It's sort of like when we had those discussions about holding debates during elections, when Stephen Harper said he wouldn't go, and everyone said, well, then it's not a real debate if the incumbent doesn't come, if the person who's leading the country, the prime minister, doesn't show up to a debate, there's no point in having it. So it is a strange dynamic that in a way almost confirms that Poilievre at this stage has a bit more power than the party itself.
Yeah, which is a remarkable thing. I guess you could have said the same was true of Trudeau in 2012 and 2013, that he was he had such a constituency of his own that it was sort of bigger than the party. I mean, granted, his constituency was built on sort of the sort of traditional liberal voters, and people were associated him and his name with the Liberal Party. So I don't know if it's necessarily quite the same, but I do think that, like, Poilievre is in a position now where his sway over the party and his constituency sway over the party is something the party's going to have to contend with. And it's unclear sort of where that all goes, and whether everybody's going to be on board with it, and kind of what it means for the party. But at this point, it does seem like, that I don't know that senior conservatives are really going to be able to kind of direct Poilievre so much as Poilievre is going to direct this ship entirely.
You mentioned, whether everybody's going to be happy with it. There was a word this week of Joël Godin still saying that he might not be willing to sit in a conservative party led by Pierre Poilievre, but he's really the only name. There's also a senator, but I mean, senators come and go in terms of what caucus they're sitting in the Senate these days. But there is that question. But you look at the fundraising figures. So Pierre Poilievre raised $4 million, which is what was reported by Elections Canada. They didn't process all of the fundraising in June, which just shows how much fundraising that came in through the leadership campaign. So the Poilievre campaign is claiming they've raised $5.3 million from 45,000 contributors, which is an enormous number. That's usually what a national party can do if they have a good quarter. That's a huge amount of money. Jean Charest, he raised $1.4 million, probably more than that after things are counted. That's also a huge amount of money. Any other campaign raising $1 million is good. I remember when Peter MacKay, the first time we got fundraising figures, or I think he was the first person to announce he raised $1 million in 2020, everybody was very impressed. And now we look at these numbers from Jean Charest and we're like, yeah, he's doomed.
Yeah. I don't think Charest, like, there's been moments in this campaign when Charest looked like he was kind of getting around to a solid, comprehensive argument against Poilievre, and then it just sort of seemed to never quite get the pieces put together. And they were going hard. The Charest campaign was trying to go hard on Poilievre on Twitter and online about the fact that he wasn't showing up to the debate, but it feels like too little, too late, and it just doesn't feel like it came fast enough or hard enough for Charest, or that he kind of put it to get all the pieces together in time. To the larger question of the party going forward, I do think, it's interesting to hear like Aaron O'Toole has come out and said, that he's a bit worried about populism and where things are going. Scott Aitchison makes these kind of oblique, vague references to we can't be the party of division, we can't just be railing against government. But then he doesn't quite say, sort of what happens if that does happen. It will be interesting to me to see whether, there are conservatives who say, you know what, I'm not really on board for this. I don't really like where Poilievre's going, and I'm going to step aside. And I think that question will almost becomes more interesting if he continues to succeed and pile up fundraising numbers and the party does okay in the polls, because it's a lot easier to get along when the party's doing well. If the party suddenly goes down to 25% or 20%, or it looks like Pierre Poilievre is a net negative for the party, it might be easy for people to step aside. But, do they have the kind of moral certainty, I guess, to say I'm not on for this if the party's doing well? And I don't think that's a completely abstract question, because we've seen populism in other countries in different cases, and not every case is the same. But the question gets raised of whether sort of people within the party structure are willing to stand up and say, no, this isn't a healthy way to do things. I'm going to step aside, or I'm going to stand in the way of this. And on the evidence, it looks like when a populist comes along, party, mainstream senior figures in parties are more than happy to go along with it if it means succeeding. And so I do think it is an open question of whether the Conservative Party, if there are people who have misgivings about the way Poilievre does politics, whether they're content to kind of say those things quietly behind closed doors but not do anything about it, or whether they're willing to kind of stand up and say, actually, this isn't what I signed up for.
And you can talk about examples on the left as well. Think of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. There was a time when it seemed like he had a lot of momentum, he had a decent election result, and it seemed like people within the party weren't very happy with him, but they were willing to go along for a little while. And then once things started to tank, that was it, right? So it is easy to go along when things are going well. I guess the challenge is what happens when things aren't going well. And for Jean Charest, I'm not sure if he's considering starting a new party on his own, but he raised as much money as the NDP did. If he gets 25% of the vote, 400,000 people who vote, that's 100,000 members. There is the potential for a viable party there in terms of just an organization and a base of fundraising, but it is a big step. It is like a Rubicon kind of thing to do, to kind of quit and start a new party and try to get people to join you.
Because the argument, and you're right, and because the argument will always be, look, you're not going to form government that way. You're just going to split the vote on the right. You're just going to doom us to, more liberal victories in elections. Why would you bother doing it? And I like, that's the very practical argument against it. I think it comes down to whether people think there is something fundamentally they can't agree with, or that the Conservative Party needs to break up because in the long term that's better for Canadian politics in some way. And I don't know whether people are ready to cross that line. It is interesting when you put it that way that Jean Charest, if you ignore how well Poilievre's doing, Charest actually looks like he's doing okay. I don't know that Charest is necessarily the figure to lead that party, but it is an interesting development that Charest was able to, at least put forward some kind of a viable campaign at a time when you would think the party was completely turning away from what he stood for and who he was and the things he's done in his past. If I think even Poilievre's campaign said sort of last night, like, a failed Liberal premier who loves carbon taxes. If that, you would think that would, most Conservatives would sort of agree with that take at this point. But if Charest was able to kind of show that there is a constituency for that, then it is interesting to wonder where that constituency goes when this race is over.
If you were trying to imagine and create the perfect leader of a sort of a new progressive conservative party, you wouldn't come up with Jean Charest because of the baggage he has, and the fact that he's been around for so long. You would imagine someone different, but it is interesting to think about what's going to happen next. But eventually, the rubber will hit the road, and let's go back to those fundraising numbers. Poilievre raising that much money, more than the Conservative Party did in the quarter, and usually the Conservatives, if they can get $5 million, that's a good quarter for them. So, like, what are the chances that he takes over and the party just gets behind him and things are going well, and they start looking at the next election?
I mean, I think that's sort of the likeliest scenario to me. I think all the incentives in politics are for parties and partisans to hang together, because as soon as they start breaking up, as soon as they start disagreeing with each other, they tank their chances of winning, and winning is better than losing. And it's easier to sort of go along and try to hold the fort together and hope to succeed that way. I don't like lots of people will speculate about the party breaking up. They have speculated about the party breaking up, or a new party, or all sorts of scenarios. But I think that's kind of fantasy baseball. I think I think in 99 times out of 100, partisans are going to stick together, because that's the way you get office, and your side being in office is always viewed as better, ultimately, than the other side having office, and so you're going to stick together. I think I'd be shocked if there was another political party that formed, or if the party broke up. But there is that one time in 100 where you wonder whether, the comments that O'Toole has made, and the Charest campaign has shown, and even some of the comments that Scott Aitchison has made, you wonder if that leads to something, even if it's not another party, whether that leads to some people sort of putting their hand up and saying, I'm not going to run in the next election. But again, I think people get ahead of themselves and assume that the most dramatic scenario is going to play out, where I think, all things considered, the most likely scenario is that Poilievre leads the Conservative Party into the next election, and maybe there are a couple defections, but otherwise the party hangs together.
Yeah, or some MPs who decide not to run again, that kind of thing. Nothing too dramatic. We kind of saw that with the Ontario election. A lot of MPPs who dated from the pre-Ford era seemed to be moving on, because they didn't have a lot of time to think about it when he became leader in 2018. So we'll see if that kind of thing happens. But if it is Poilievre who wins, which, I mean, everybody assumes it is going to be, it would be, I would term it maybe the upset of it would be a huge upset if Poilievre didn't end up winning this. Like, it would be hard to think of one that would be a bigger upset in Canadian history, just in terms of how the juggernaut he seems to have. But how does he match up, do you think, right now in 2025 against Trudeau, against maybe not Trudeau, against a government that's in power for 10 years? Is the energy we see from his campaign, is it very specific to his small kind of base of supporters within the party? But can it translate to electoral success?
I think he's the most formidable of the Conservative leaders Trudeau has faced. You could make a possible exception of Harper in 2015, although Harper at that point had a lot of baggage and was the incumbent and was pretty vulnerable. I think Poilievre, you can try to explain it away and say, oh, it's very specific, or it's the Conservative base, but it's not beyond that. But I think the Liberals would be making a massive mistake if they just assumed that this was a passing phenomenon or a limited appeal kind of thing. I think Poilievre has talent, and he's shown an ability to get people riled up, and I think the sort of real world economic and political ground is there for him to take advantage of, right? We've got inflation, we could have a recession, housing prices are far too high for most people. This is the kind of situation where somebody like Poilievre could really capitalize on it. I mean, that said, I don't know that. I mean, I don't know. I think it's almost impossible to predict how this plays out. I think Poilievre feels to me like a high variance. Like, he I could totally imagine him leading the Conservative Party to 40% in the popular vote in the next election. I could totally imagine his politics not playing very well and then going down to 25%. It feels like there's a pretty wide range of possibilities here. But I think he is the biggest test the Liberals have faced in terms of Conservative leaders. And he has a lot of potential to make some serious inroads with kind of the great, the general voter, and pose a real challenge to Trudeau.
I think one of the biggest issues that Conservatives have had for the last few elections is that they've assumed that a lot of voters, or almost all Canadians, dislike Trudeau as much as they do. And it seems to me like the Liberals could make the same mistake if they assume that everybody will dislike Poilievre as much as they do, because clearly this is not a relationship that is a positive one between the two parties. That Liberals love to hate Poilievre, and Poilievre loves to hate the Liberals, right? So it's not setting up for an uplifting campaign, whenever it will be.
But the comparison I think is apt, because Trudeau leads Conservatives to do one of two in the sort of decade that Trudeau has been around. He's led Conservatives to sort of make one of two mistakes. Either they underestimate him and they kind of go, well, this guy's a lightweight, or they get so riled up by his presence and his politics that they almost overplay their hand. They swing too hard and they miss. And then Trudeau takes advantage of the situation. And I think I can very plausibly imagine the Liberals having the same reaction to Poilievre and thinking, this guy is a fringe extreme candidate and we'll take him out easily. Or they think, or they get so riled up by his politics and his manner that they're going to swing too hard and miss. And I think they need to kind of think about it in those terms if they're going to try to figure out how to beat him, because he's not a rookie politician. He's not. He gives some thought to what he's doing, and he's clearly got some talent. And the situation is to his advantage to a certain extent at this point. It's an incumbent government that's been around for 7 years. The economic situation is hard. People have had a very difficult 2 or 3 years with the pandemic. This is a situation that starts to tilt in Poilievre's favor at some point, and the Liberals have to figure out, both in their words and their actions, how they're going to combat that.
With every passing year, you would increase the odds that there's a change of government, right? So Poilievre being the person who's there, that he gets the first shot at it. So that's the Conservatives. They can look towards the next election with some optimism. They can, whether or not it'll come, whether they'll actually win the next election, we'll have to wait and see. The Greens, maybe not so optimistic about the future. They've been having some trouble with fundraising. They talk about how they don't really have any money. They've had to make cuts within their own organization. Obviously, there's been the leadership turmoil for the last few years, and there is actually a leadership race happening right now. We are going to find out who is the list of candidates at the end of the month. The list of potential candidates is not one that I don't think anybody outside of the Green Party would recognize any name, with the exception of Elizabeth May, who seems to be wanting to come back. She was leader for 13 years and resigned in 2019, said it was time for some new energy, a renewal for the party, and now she wants to come back. So what does that mean for the Greens if it's Elizabeth May again? Even if she says she wants to run with a kind of a co-leader candidate, it's Elizabeth May again. It's not the new Green Party.
No. It's so, when she left, when she announced she was leaving in 2019, I thought it was pretty clear that the Green Party had kind of reached its ceiling with Elizabeth May as leader. It had gotten back up the popular vote to, I think it was 6.5 or 6.6%. It had won 3 seats, but I think it had probably gone as far as Elizabeth May was going to be able to take it. They'd gone into that campaign. It feels like a lifetime ago, but they'd gone into that campaign with people thinking, oh, maybe the Greens can surprise some people. Maybe this is their chance for a breakthrough. Maybe they can even surpass the NDP in the seat count, because the NDP was really vulnerable going into that campaign. And then the Greens kind of fumbled it away. Elizabeth May had a tough start to the campaign, and they ended up okay, but they didn't have that big breakthrough. And it did feel like, okay, they've Elizabeth May's taken them this far. It's time for somebody else. I guess the way to spin it now is, if you're trying to make a case for bringing Elizabeth May back, is they've now crashed through the floor that Elizabeth May seemingly had set for them, and even getting back to where she had taken them, 6% in the poll in the popular vote, would be a major victory for them at this point. And so, she's a known quantity. She has a gift for getting attention. People know who she is. At least some people seem to like her. Maybe you bring her back and try to stabilize this thing, because that's what they need right now, right? Like, it looks like they are in free fall, and they need somebody to kind of put the floor back under them. But as I wrote in a piece earlier this week, like, even if you make the case that she should come back, and that's a good answer for this party right now, however long she's in leader however long this sort of second go round lasts, the focus really needs to be on building a party that can survive without her, and can find other leadership candidates who can take this party and move it forward, and a party apparatus that isn't going to turn on itself whenever that new leader comes in, or if that new leader, if there's difficulties. You just can't, Elizabeth May can't be the leader forever. And the Greens need to find a way to have somebody else as leader, and they need to find a party apparatus that can get them, can kind of stand up to whatever pressures come after it.
In your piece, you had referenced Joe Clark coming back as leader of the PCs after Charest left. And it was kind of the same scenario. Someone needs to come in. This party's not in good shape. Here's someone who is a familiar face, but it wasn't really a sign that this party was on track for anything great in the future, right? It doesn't really give the signal of renewal and momentum, something new. Which maybe is why she wants to run with a co-candidate, which gives something a bit different. We have seen this in Green parties elsewhere in the world. Quebec Solidaire uses that system in Quebec, though in reality, it always ends up just being one candidate who's put forward as the premier candidate who takes part in the debates and all that kind of thing. So I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of that attempt to try to bolt on a two-leader system to a parliamentary system. Is not really friendly to that.
Yeah, it's not. It feels like it feels like you're sort of conceding that you're not going to be in government, right? Like, you're saying, like, we've got co-leaders. We're not. Don't worry about asking us which one of us will be prime minister, because realistically, we're not going to get there anytime soon. I think the co-leader system could work in this situation if it's used to sort of take the known quantity of Elizabeth May and the sort of her sort of built-in brand, and use it to kind of piggyback on a new kind of generation of leaders, or someone who could lead the party going forward after she steps aside. I think that could have some promise. I mean, I think if there is a lot of work that this party has to do internally, there could be some value in having two people to sort of share that workload, and while Elizabeth May is sort of out, waving the flag for the party, maybe somebody else is working on building the party structure up. But I do think it comes back, that Joe Clark comparison. He kept the party alive for 5 years. He won some sort of admiration amongst people who followed politics. But let's not forget that he stepped down in May of 2003, and before the calendar year was over, that party didn't exist anymore. And that's not a model I don't think anybody wants to follow. And the Greens need to. So I think that's the lesson to the Greens. And as I wrote in the piece, like, I think the Greens need to face up to the existential question of, like, if the PC party can disappear, there's no reason the Greens can't. And as much as you would think this is the Green Party's moment because the climate is such a salient issue now. We're well past the time when the climate was a fringe issue. This should be a moment for the Green Party to really assert itself. They can't take for granted that they are on a walking a very thin line at this point, and if they don't kind of get their act together and figure this out in the next year or so, there's no reason to believe they couldn't just sort of fade away as a political entity, at least at the federal level.
Yeah, at the provincial level, they have some viable parties that are doing well enough in parts of Atlantic Canada. They're either second or third. Replace the NDP in Atlantic Canada, in some cases replacing the Liberals, but it's a very different brand of Green Party politics there. It's very anti the old system. It's more anti-partisan, non-partisan than it is the kind of Green support you see in British Columbia, for example. And the party itself has lots of divisions. It started a bit more of a center-right kind of party. Elizabeth May's background was she once advised Brian Mulroney. There's elements within the party of the eco-socialists that are very far to the left. There's lots of issues related to Israel. For some reason, the party in Canada that's most split over Israel seems to be the Green Party, which does not seem to, it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think anybody's looking for leadership on Palestine-Israel issues from the Green Party. There are a lot of issues there that they have to deal with internally before they even get to the question you said. What's the point of this party when you have the New Democrats and the Liberals, while they might not be perfect, have climate change and fighting climate change as one of their priorities? It is a puzzle for the Greens. What's next for them?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to parse the Annamie Paul experience and figure out sort of how to apportion blame between her and the party apparatus and senior figures and so on and so forth. But it's clear, like I think the takeaway from that whole era was that this does not seem to have been a party that was set up to kind of manage itself in the post-May era, and so it needs to figure that out. It can't be so precarious, and then I think, yeah, you have to figure out what this party is like. Does this party need to exist, and if so, why? Because we were talking about kind of fantasy baseball in the last discussion, but like you can very easily sit back and go, well, why don't the Greens and the Democrats just merge? Like, why don't the eco left parts of the Green Party just join the NDP and whatever other elements there are of the Green Party can just sort of fade away. And, except for the fact that it seems to exist at the provincial level in a certain, like in a kind of resilient, sustainable way in some places. It's not necessarily clear why the federal Green Party needs to exist at this moment. And they need to, not only kind of rebuild, but sort of re-justify themselves. And, so to come back to Elizabeth May, like it makes sense to bring her back if, she's sort of a stopgap solution that can be part of rebuilding the whole apparatus. But she's certainly not a savior for this party. And they still have to figure out what they're going to do with someone else's leader and where that other leader is going to come from.
Where they would run. I think that Elizabeth May's biggest asset she can bring is her seat, which is a relatively winnable one for another Green leader because they only have the two MPs. Mike Morris doesn't want to run to be the leader. And Annamie Paul could have used the seat in the House. It would have made things a lot easier for her. So, but this doesn't seem like it's going to open up a path for someone else to run in her riding and have a seat in the House of Commons. So, I'm not sure. It just feels like the Greens have had a rough few years since 2019. It's just been an issue after an issue, and lots of decisions that don't seem to make much sense from the outside as to why a party would do this. I think the Annamie Paul story, regardless of who was to blame, there seems to be blame that is all around there. It was just not what a party that is always fighting for relevance needs, not these questions about, are you a serious party?
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable that a party that is that is fighting for every inch of ground it can get would lose perspective so greatly that they would kind of turn on themselves and start fighting internally, because they just don't have that luxury. I mean, no party really does, but a party that's lucky to get to 6% in the polls really doesn't have that luxury, and they they have to come out of this leadership one way or another with some kind of direction and unity. And the threat hanging, I really do think the threat hanging over them is whether this party really continues or not.
The Conservatives are choosing their leader in a little over a month, September 10th. The Greens have a 2-stage leadership process, which is, again, a little unusual, but we'll have the leader of the party in November, and then we'll have some answers to what's next from both of these parties, which will be helpful. So thanks so much, Aaron. I really appreciate you coming on. You put in some work watching the debate last night, so I think you get extra credit for that, and I appreciate you sharing your insights with us today.
I'm just here to help fill you in on what you missed.
Thanks to Aaron for that discussion, and thank you for watching. If you did enjoy this video, I hope that you'll subscribe to this YouTube channel and share this video around. Until next week, thanks for watching.